have to focus on implementation. The pledges are out there. There are some excellent examples of good practice. The challenge now is to deliver on the pledges and to scale up implementation. That's a challenge which I sense the sector is up for. That's a challenge which I believe African governments embrace. But let's not kid ourselves. We've got no reason to be complacent. And I don't sense at this event any feeling of complacency at all. We are in the business of creating a green revolution for Africa that benefits the marginalized, that benefits the poor, particularly the rural poor. Let's not kid ourselves that we have overcome the obstacles to the improvement of their lives and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals.
I'm very fascinated when I hear talk about access to global markets, yet we have a huge market here on the continent, but we're hardly trading between one another. I mean, GDP-wise, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is what, $2.3 trillion US dollars. Before we think about the Chinas of this world, shouldn't we first trade among Africans? Shouldn't this be the priority?
I don't think it's either or. We have to do both. If you're in business, your concern is to sell your product. You will sell your product wherever you are able to. African governments have an immediate task in hand of making a reality of the African Free Trade Agreement, of delivering the promises that have been made by heads of government in Addis and beyond. That's a very important task. It is a priority for African governments. But at the same time, part of the challenge of government is to recognize that Africa is part of a wider global trading world, and they want to make sure, rightly and understandably, that African producers get a chance, one, to add value and to export the product of that added value with the minimum of disruption. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to see jobs created in Africa, we're not going to see inequality addressed in Africa. And the Sustainable Development Goals demand that globally we address both the issue of inequality and the jobs, particularly for the young, particularly for women.
You've mentioned inequality, and in your past life, of course, you were the High Commissioner to a country that the IMF just declared one of the most unequal countries across the world. That's, of course, South Africa. If we're to bring the challenges that the continent has, how do you move forward? How do you empower the youth, empower the young, address inequality? Food security is on one end. This is a tough task.
It's a very tough task. It's a task, however, that can only be met if we have partnerships. Partnerships between the public sector and the private sector. Partnerships between civil society, legislatures, and businesses. Partnerships between traditional modes of governance and our democratically elected governments, their populations, their businesses. So it's a multifaceted challenge, but it is one that can only be met if we focus on delivery of the strategies, implementation of the policies, creating an enabling environment for business. And let me give you just one example of that. I was yesterday at an extremely successful business here in Rwanda, Kigali Farms. Part of the African Enterprise Challenge Fund's investment strategy, which I am responsible for as chair of the fund, a multi-donor fund, $356 million under management, a 30% increase last year in our impact. We made an early investment in Kigali Farms. They're exporting mushrooms, top quality mushrooms. I met with the women in the rural areas who are producing these mushrooms. I met with the entrepreneur, the food scientists, and others whose vision and foresight and commitment to Africa and to agriculture has enabled the business to get where it is. Do you know what holds them back? The delays at the border. The delays at the border as they try and export to Kenya and to other countries in East Africa. So with all the statements of good intent that issue from heads of government, all the work, and it's been a lot of work that's gone into the Africa Free Trade Agreement, if we don't reduce the delays at the border, then that inhibits growth, that inhibits trade, that inhibits the creation of jobs and the ability of young people and women in particular to access a productive economy. So it's all about implementation. It's all about delivering on the promises that have been made. But we don't address these big issues of global trade, of regional trade, of inequality and job creation without creating an enabling environment for business and for entrepreneurs.
We cannot talk about agriculture in Africa without addressing the challenges that women have. We do know that they constitute close to 70% of the smallholder farmer. What prescriptions could we actually hear from you? You are making a lot of presentations here when it comes to enabling women, having them involved. Well, and this usually fits into the access to finance, but what prescriptions could be here?
Well, women, of course, are involved because they're doing the heavy labor.
Yeah, the heavy lifting.
They're doing the production. What they're not receiving is the benefit from that. What they are not being able to participate in is value chains that enhance their livelihoods. And we have to address that with a degree of intentionality that hasn't always been there. We've got to actively remove obstacles to finance. We've got actively to promote technical assistance to enable women to fulfill their potential. And we have to address cultural and other practices that effectively exclude women. So it requires intentionality. The good news is that I see that intentionality now coming into the picture. Let me give you an example. On September the 18th in Abidjan, we are launching an investment in women in agribusiness competition, which will enable women in agribusiness and women-owned businesses and businesses that benefit women specifically, enable them to access soft loans and grants of between $100,000 and $1.5 million, where they can demonstrate an impact on the rural poor that benefits women.